Let's see. Today, I think we are moving into the second half of our look at other Gospels. So I think what I've shown you is that primarily most of the other Gospels that did not make their way into the New Testament, that are non-canonical Gospels, most of them probably fall into what we would classify as heretical. Like the Ebionites, the Nazarites, the Marcions, the Gnostics. We've seen examples of those so far when we took a look at the four basic categories of Gospels. We looked at the narrative Gospels. We looked at sayings Gospels. What we're going to do today is look at infancy Gospels and passion Gospels. Again, let me emphasize that we actually saw one or two examples last week of Gospels that could easily have made the New Testament. There was nothing heretical about them. They simply did not make the cut, as I said, for perhaps one of three reasons, but primarily because they weren't either old or the three principles are they have to be ancient, have to going back to the first century, they have to be written by an apostle, and they have to be universally acclaimed, basically popular. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were popular. And they also happen to be ancient Gospels going back to the first century. Were they written by the apostles? There's a stretch on that. We don't know who wrote them, but they do bear the names of apostles or disciples of apostles. So, and those were the standards. So those few Orthodox Gospels that did not make the cut because they weren't old enough. Other than that, there was nothing wrong with some of them. But you'll get a chance to see some very bizarre stuff today, like we did last time. So with that as an introduction, let me open up with a word of prayer. Okay. Gracious God, again, we are so thankful for the gift of your Spirit abiding in us, uniting us one to another, and making your Son a reality within our hearts and souls. Grant us the same mind that was in Christ Jesus, so that even in our frail and flawed ways, in all of our decisions, we may act out of love and compassion. Help us to be faithful servants and faithful witnesses to the great grace you've made known to us, the salvation you've afforded us through your Son. It is in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. Okay, let's see what we can do here. Infancy Gospels. I'm going to show you two of them tonight. Let me see. After the New Testament Gospels were written, Christians began to tell stories about Jesus as an infant and a young boy. The Gospels were fascinating stories, and so it's only natural, as I've seen in the life of the church in my 30-something years as an ordained minister. People have questions. What was Jesus like as a little boy? What was going on? We know of his birth. We see a little incident of him when he was 12, and then suddenly the next thing we see is he's an adult around 30 years of age. What gives? There's a lot of gaps there in the life of Jesus, and it's the same thing in our current generation as it was in previous generations. Christians just had questions. What was Jesus doing when he was a teenager? What was Jesus doing when he was an infant? Okay. Some people set out to try to tell those stories, to answer those questions. Later authors collected some of the stories into written texts, the so-called infancy Gospels, which began to be produced by the first part of the 2nd century at the latest. Most of them are later than that, but it's not until the first part of the 2nd century that these things actually start getting written down. You can see two examples I've got up here: the Proto-Gospel of James, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Okay. Now, what is a proto-gospel? Well, I'll answer that question in a moment. I think we're going to start out with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This should not be confused, with the Gospel of Thomas. They are not the same thing, despite the fact that it bears the name Thomas. I want to emphasize, by the way, that these titles are pseudonymous. They are attributed to Thomas, or to Philip, or to James, or to Judas, or to other gospel writers, but they are not written by these apostles. Okay, the efforts to try to give credulity, to give credibility to the text, is made more believable if you tell the people who are reading it, oh, Thomas wrote this. Make sense? Okay. And since Thomas is not around to deny it, of course, yeah. Well, hey, yeah, I found this. Thomas must have written this. Okay. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Fun stories about Jesus. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. Remember, that's the that gospel that is a collection of Jesus' sayings, 114 sayings. All of, and we are pretty convinced that they are. It's Gnostic in nature. That this is a document dating around 125 A.D. Okay, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This is a fascinating account of Jesus' youth, beginning at age 5, and you're going to see it's going to finish when he's 12. And the reason it finishes when he's 12 is because that's all they're doing when writing the story, is trying to take us up to what we know about Jesus in Luke's Gospel. In Luke's Gospel, there's that incident of him teaching in the temple when he was 12, right? Okay. Behind the narrative lies a question which intrigues some Christians even today. If Jesus was a miracle-working Son of God as an adult, what was he like as a child? Okay, because anyone who has children, I don't have children, but I've got nieces and nephews. I see how they are. I know parents. I know how I was. You're going to try the limits of your parents. That's because that's the job of children, right? That's what they do. And it's just the nature of humanity that parents are supposed to establish the rules to show that human beings have to live by rules. Children are going to press the envelope to see how far they can get. Basically, that's how we learn to live in life, right? How to live by rules and just how far we can press those rules to get by, right? In some ways, we never outgrow our childhood. Okay. According to this account, Jesus was more than a little mischievous. He was the Son of God as Dennis the Menace. This is as the way the story is told here in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. When he first appears in the text, he is making clay sparrows by the stream on the Sabbath. Now, that doesn't sound like something out of the range of what children would be doing. He's playing in the mud, right? A child is playing in the mud. That's what baby Jesus or little toddler Jesus is doing. He's making little clay sparrows out of the mud by the stream. Okay, he just so happens to be doing this though on the Sabbath, when you're not supposed to be doing any work, right? A Jewish man passing by sees what he has done and upbraids him for violating the law by not keeping the Sabbath day holy. Okay. Instead of apologizing, the child Jesus claps his hands and tells the sparrows to be gone. They come to life and fly away, thereby destroying any evidence of Jesus' wrongdoing. How clever. What a clever story this is, right? And this is the kind of thing that you would think, well, Jesus is the Son of God. He's a miracle worker. These are little clay pigeons or clay sparrows. If anyone can breathe life into them, it's the Son of God, right? If Jesus can resurrect Lazarus, certainly child Jesus can turn clay birds into real birds, and they fly away. Okay, you can just see the story, can't you? The birds fly away, and Jesus says to the old Jewish man, "What birds? You know, what birds? I mean, what are you talking about? I didn't do anything." So that's one particular story.
But he was unaware of his miraculous.
I'm sorry. Say something more about it. What?
He was unaware of his. At 5 to 12, he was unaware of what.
You know, that what you're wrestling with in saying that is exactly the types of questions that Christians today and then were asking. When did Jesus know of his special relationship to God the Father? And by the way, we as theologians today still ask exactly that question because it's not clear in the Gospels. When Mark, being the first gospel written, note where the story picks up. It picks up with Jesus beginning his public ministry at the baptism of John, where John baptizes Jesus. And there you see this booming voice from heaven as the heavens are split open, and the voice says, "You are my son." No one else in the crowd hears it in Mark's gospel. This is simply addressed to Jesus. And the implication in Mark's gospel, we can draw this inference, is that Jesus discovers at that moment his special relationship to God the Father because God tells him, God reveals it. But that begs the question, was Jesus aware of it beforehand? Well, Matthew and Luke, who come later, actually try to address exactly that concern when they introduced nativity stories about Jesus. And those stories are immediately designed to indicate that his birth was the very beginning of the divine plan, that he was the Son of God from the beginning. The angel in a dream to Joseph announces this in Matthew's Gospel. The angel Gabriel announces it to Mary in Luke's Gospel, that this child is the Son of the Most High. So from the very beginning, he's the Son of God. Does he know that? Does he know that through his life? That's the question. The audience knows it. You and I know it because we're reading the story. And we know that Jesus becomes aware of it in Mark's Gospel at the baptism. But when did he know it?
Why would he have gone and lectured at the age of 12 to the rabbis if he didn't understand that there was something unique about it, nothing else?
Well, that's interesting. If you look at the story, he doesn't lecture to them. Specifically in the story in Luke, he is listening to their teaching, and they are amazed at how studious he is. There's nothing in the text that that indicates that Jesus is instructing them. It's the other way around. Actually, he is enthralled with the teachings of the learned scholars. So that's one of those things that we actually project on the text that's not there. Technically, in the story of in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is never instructing or teaching. Now, as I say, I'm not. Look it up. That is the case. He is there.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember that we had another class and we talked about that. And they were pretty insistent that I thought that he.
Well, I don't know.
Well, maybe it was a two-way thing, and they were. But I mean, for him to be that learned by that point in time would tend to indicate that he was special too, I guess.
Yeah, well, certainly there's no doubt that, certainly in Matthew and Luke's Gospel, it's very clear that there's something special about him because he's conceived immaculate, by a virgin birth, that he's conceived by the Holy Spirit. So obviously there's something going on here, right? There's something special about him. And we know this. The readers are in on it. The readers have sort of a God's eye view of the story. The question still remains, how much does Jesus really know about it? Certainly, Jesus was aware in Luke's Gospel that he has some special relationship, especially since he says in that story, why to his parents, who probably should have spanked him, but why were you looking about for me? Didn't you realize I should be in my Father's house? That statement immediately indicates that Jesus recognizes something special about his relationship to the Father, but that doesn't. It still leaves us questioning: does he fully understand what that means? The whole question in Mark's Gospel about what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah is the whole key driving point of Mark's Gospel. What does it mean to be the Messiah? Everyone thinks he's supposed to be some regal figure who will sit on the throne, or they think that he's some apocalyptic figure who will come down from heaven with his armies of angels. When in fact, what it turns out, and this is the real punch of Mark's Gospel, no, the Messiah is a guy that's supposed to be the Son of God who surrenders and suffers and dies for the sins of the world, an atoning sacrifice for human sin. Not at all what people are expecting. So yes, it makes sense that people are going to be asking and wrestling with exactly these questions. How much did Jesus understand about his relationship to the Father. And is it possible that his understanding grew as he grew? And that's what's being, by the way, if you'd like to know, that's exactly what the Gospel of Thomas is trying to imply, that as Jesus develops, so does his ability to understand the awesome responsibility of his power and authority. And it starts out with him being completely irresponsible, using his miracles simply to get out of trouble. Okay, makes sense? As the story goes on here, on another occasion, when a child accidentally runs into him on the street, Jesus turns in anger and declares, "You will go no further on your way." The child falls down dead. Now, I'm not telling you this happened. I'm telling you this is what the story says. Okay, makes sense? It is. It's a sort of a harsh lesson, isn't it? As time goes on, however, Jesus begins to use his powers for good.
So he doesn't resurrect this kid? He just kills him?
It's not indicated in the story, though he does resurrect another child. And that's... and let me see if... let me jump back to that, but let me finish up this section on the infancy gospel of Thomas. The account concludes with Jesus as a 12-year-old teaching in the... it shouldn't be teaching in the temple. He doesn't teach. I need to change that. He's not teaching in the temple. It doesn't say that. I've got to be honest with the text. It doesn't say that he's teaching. Surrounded by scribes who listen to him and who bless Mary for the wonderful child she has brought into the world. By the way, now let me say, Luke's gospel, he's not teaching in the temple. In the infancy gospel, he is. Does that make sense? Okay. In the infancy gospel, he is. But if you're talking about the canonical gospels, no, Jesus is not teaching in the temple. That would be in Luke's gospel. It's the only gospel that gives us an account of Jesus when he was 12 years of age. There's another story here in the infancy gospel of Thomas that is kind of interesting. Jesus apparently is on the second floor of a building with a childhood friend, Mino. Mino falls out the window and dies. And of course, Jesus already by this time has gotten a bad reputation for being a mischievous son of God, if you will, such that people are blaming Jesus for pushing this kid out the window, when in fact Jesus did not. And this is where Jesus uses his powers of resurrection. He raises Mino from the dead so that Mino can speak for himself. Did I push you out the window? And Mino jumps up from the dead and tells everyone, no, Jesus didn't push me out the window. He uses the resurrected child as evidence that Jesus, in fact, did not act maliciously. I know it is.
Yeah, he was a killer for the other kid.
Yeah, I know it's now it's, as I say, it is sometimes difficult to see Jesus in this light. This was meant as a good story. It was the efforts of the infancy gospel of Thomas was meant to do something positive, to try to show how Jesus came to understand his powers for the good of God. Does that make sense? That was its intention. It's a development story where Jesus had many options to go bad, but he does not. He allows his powers, which could corrupt him, to become something that he will submit himself to for the good of God. Make sense?
Is this about the only time where Mary is something nice is said about Mary, his mother?
I think she is praised, at least in this gospel, for raising such a spiritually devout son.
Yeah. That's about all it's said about her.
In this story, yes. Mary is an interesting character. She, in all of the Gospels, she is. She's not. Believe it or not, she's not mentioned a lot in the New Testament. She really isn't. Did you know that Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than she is in the New Testament? I kid you not. That's true. Mary is held in high regard in the Quran. She's held in high regard in the New Testament too, but she's mentioned maybe 20-something times in the New Testament. She's mentioned 46 times in the Quran. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. Well, Jesus is regarded with highly in the Quran, just not as the Son of God. That's considered blasphemous in Islam. So, all right. So the proto-gospel of James. Let's say what this is. What is a proto-gospel? Well, as the word implies, proto means, in this case, first or before the gospel. Okay, so this is a story that predates Jesus. The proto-gospel of James is a book that leads up to the stories of Mary and Joseph before the birth of Jesus. Okay, because they're trying to answer some very interesting theological questions. Very early on in the history of the church, there was never a doubt, based on the witnesses of Matthew and Luke, that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was born. But the tradition that Mary was ever virgin was in development. Now, how could that be? How can we hold Mary as the ever virgin Mary if, in fact, we have mention of Jesus' brothers and sisters in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6? Where did his brothers and sisters come from if Mary and Joseph had no sexual relations before or after the birth of Jesus? Okay, does that make sense? Most Protestants don't have problems with this. We just assume that Mary and Joseph had standard marital relations after Jesus was born. Okay, but Christian theology, Christian doctrine, sometimes demanded a different way of answering the question, and that's how the proto-gospel of James ends up being written. This account narrates the events prior to Jesus' birth in order to address the following questions. Why was Mary chosen to bear the Son of God? Have you ever asked yourself that question? That question is not answered in the Gospels, the canonical Gospels. Why Mary? Okay. The account provides pious reflections which give the answer. Mary herself was born miraculously and was set apart for the service of God at a young age. She was predestined, basically, you're going to see. Mary's birth to Joachim and Anna was supernatural, much like Samuel in the Hebrew Bible and John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, Mary has and by the way, this gives you the name of Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna. Okay, but
What made her birth supernatural?
she was conceived immaculately, thus the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Everyone thinks that the doctrine of Immaculate Conception implies the Immaculate Conception of Jesus. It's not. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception in Roman Catholicism is the doctrine that Mary was conceived miraculously, without human intervention. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. That's the and that doctrine comes from and is probably supported by this gospel, okay, the proto-gospel of James. Okay, and how they know that Mary's parents are Joachim and Anna, I don't know, but that's according to the story. That's where that comes from. There are some Catholic hymns that mention Mary's mother, Anne, so they're drawing. The Roman Catholic tradition is drawing from this writing for that information. Does that make sense? Okay. At 3 years of age, Mary was given over to the temple, where she lived until she was 12, cared for and fed by an angel of God. So basically, her parents just dedicated her to the temple, and she was raised in the temple, fed by angels. Okay. I'm not believe that or don't. I'm just telling you that's what the story says. Okay. Okay. At age 12, the priests could not allow her to live in the temple any longer. Having reached the age of menstruation, she would compromise the purity of the sanctuary, which is true according to Jewish law. A menstruating woman was considered ritually unclean. That was always the case in Judaism. Okay, does that make sense? I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but that's what was the case. And of course, age 12, she's becoming a woman, right? And so she can't stay in the temple. That would be sacrilege. But what to do, right? What do we do with this special little girl at age 12? Okay. An elderly widower named Joseph, who had sons from a previous marriage, was selected to be her guardian. Okay.
Oh, wow.
At 16, Mary conceived Jesus by the Holy Spirit. Now, Joseph is betrothed to her, but is her guardian. Okay, and by the way, he's an elderly man. Okay, one of the reasons by this tradition that he is selected to be her guardian is that what can he do? He's an old man. He's basically, the implication is that he is aged out into impotence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's the implication of the story. Anyway,
And
it
that's
was
how Jesus had brothers and sisters, because Joseph had children before.
they're, according to the tradition, they're half brothers.
Yes.
That's correct.
All right.
That's how it works. That's right.
But they're really not blood kin if that's the case.
They're not blood kin. That is correct. Any more so than Joseph is blood kin as father to Jesus. That's right.
Okay.
While in Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph took refuge in a cave as she went into labor. Okay. Mary gave birth in private as Joseph sought the services of a midwife. And it's an interesting story. I've actually seen on the History Channel, they actually did a short vignette filming this story from the Proto-Gospel of James. And it shows Mary in Bethlehem in a cave by herself as Joseph is out scrambling around town trying to find a midwife to help deliver the child. But while he is away, she gives birth. After examining Mary, Salome, the midwife, Joseph finally did find someone, discovered that Mary was miraculously intact vaginally, even after giving birth. I know, there's the furrowed brow, right? How? How is that possible, right? Well, it's because, well, in effect, yes, because the as the story goes, if Jesus in John's Gospel can pass through locked doors to appear to the disciples in his post-resurrection accounts, certainly Jesus can pass through the walls of the womb without disturbing the vaginal intactness of Mary. So she always remains the ever-virgin Mary, you see. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not telling you this is true. I'm simply telling you this is the story.
Fairy story.
This is the Proto-Gospel of James.
When was
Okay.
this was written in 125?
This one was probably written in the maybe in the latter part of the 2nd century. But
We've
yeah.
actually discussed in previous Bible studies about the cave scenario, not the rest of it, but that Jesus wasn't born in the manger, that perhaps he was in fact born in a cave.
Oh yeah, I mean it's interesting that it never says anything. And by the way, if you check the Gospel of Luke, again there are so many stories that we associate with Christmas that we believe by tradition, not by Scripture. There is nothing that says there are 3 wise men. That surprises people when I tell them. There are wise men. It doesn't give a number. We always assume there are 3. We always assume that Mary and Joseph, Mary's riding on a donkey as they go to Bethlehem. Never says that. And we always assume that they knock on the door of the inn and it's a mean innkeeper who tells them they can't have a room. There's no innkeeper in the gospel. It's not there. It's less than half a verse. They get to Bethlehem and it says they laid him in a manger. Why? Because there was no room for them in the inn. Period, full stop. That's all it says in the gospel. Doesn't say anything about an innkeeper, doesn't say anything about a stable, doesn't say anything about a cave or a barn. It just says that Basically, they're out in the street. There are feeding troughs, and that's where they put Jesus when he's born, is in a feeding trough, a creche, a manger. It could have just as easily been a cave. It could have, maybe that's where it was. Maybe it was a stable. Maybe it was a barn. We don't know.
I think the
Could have been
commentary,
the front room of the house, and
True,
how
yes.
houses were built, too.
Yeah. We just don't know. We don't know the circumstances, other than the fact that the story is designed, it accomplishes exactly what Luke wants to do. It wants to imply that Jesus is of humble birth, a birth into abject poverty. That's what, because note, in Matthew's gospel, who comes to see Jesus? Learned scholars, wise men, magi. We get the word magic from that, by the way. They are, and the story goes that they're three kings. They're not. It never says they're kings. They're learned scholars. These are educated men who come to see Jesus. That's the way Matthew tells the story. In Luke, who comes to see Jesus? Shepherds, nobodies, people who have no import whatsoever. People who are. These are the people for whom Jesus came into the world. Not for the rich. He came into the world for the poor. That's how Luke's gospel unfolds. Make sense? That to me is just an amazing story in Luke's gospel about the birth of Jesus. But we build around it so many other traditions, and we conflate the traditions of Matthew and Luke's gospel together to create our manger scenes. And they're gorgeous. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not insulting our manger scenes. I'm just telling you that they are a conflation of tradition that is not biblical. And I think it's wonderful to have manger scenes. I think it's wonderful for our children to tell that story every year. But as the resident theologian, I always believe in educating the people and tell them that the manger scene, it's great for Christmas. Just recognize that there are liberties that are taken with regard to what we know from the Gospels. Okay, so don't anyone go here and go home and say, "Oh, Curtis is telling us to throw our manger scenes away." That's not true. I'm Scrooge. I'm just terrible. I'm just telling you that the stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew and in Luke are much simpler stories than what we have built up over 2,000 years of tradition.
so when the Magi and others had come to visit, he was not a newborn.
That's right. And that's what's so interesting. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is about 2 years old. In Luke's gospel, he's a newborn. In fact, he's not even 8 days old. We know that because that's 8 days is when the circumcision is supposed to take place, and that takes place after after the shepherds' visit. So you got the wise men coming to Bethlehem, strangely enough, and note where they come. They come to a house, not to a manger, not to a stable. They come to a house. And that's what I find also fascinating. And by the way, there's no indication in Luke's gospel that the shepherds are following a star. The star is in Matthew's gospel. The shepherds are simply following the instructions that the angel told them. You'll find the babe wrapped in bands of cloth, swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And so they just go through town until they find him. So it's interesting. And so boy, it does sound like I'm just stomping on Christmas. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to. I really don't. But well, let me say, by the way, that I am going to enjoy the Christmas pageant stories that the children do every year. I'm going to love it because it's tradition to tell the Christmas story that way, right?
You did it all in one day.
Well, I participate in certain traditions that have developed in Christianity that have nothing to do with technically Christmas. Wendy and I put up a Christmas tree. There's nothing biblical about that, but we do it. There's nothing biblical about Santa, but Santa's going to come and visit, right? Okay, it's the one I don't get is the Easter Bunny. I still haven't figured that one out yet. I have not figured that one out yet. Okay. All right, so the account ends with the visit of the wise men. Okay, so basically it's, which shows, by the way, that whoever wrote the proto-gospel of James doesn't know Matthew's gospel very well, because obviously the traditions of the shepherds and the wise men finding Jesus in a stable or a cave or a barn near a manger are early permutations of the Christian tradition, going back at least to the 2nd century. Okay, so we come by the error in our telling of the nativity story honestly. We've been doing it for 1,800 years. Okay, makes sense. For me, I really don't mind the lore and legend and the traditions that have permeated Christianity. That's fine. It's wonderful. They're great stories. All I want is for people to know their Bible. I just want them to be biblically literate. That's all. Does that make sense? That's what I want. So let's enjoy the stories, but let's remember what Scripture says too. Okay. There's a lot of the things that people believe Scripture says that it doesn't. God helps those who helps themselves. Maybe that's a good piece of advice, but it's not biblical. It's just not. How about this one? I should do a test sometime. Famous statements. Is this biblical or not? A fool and his money are soon parted. That is biblical. It is. It's biblical. It's in Proverbs.
Isn't that one of the things from the...
Oh, it might be one of them out there. Yeah, a fool and his money are soon parted. That's actually biblical. That's Proverbs.
And true.
Probably that's sometimes. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Yeah, there are lots of things that people say that they think sometimes are biblical but aren't, and some things that you wouldn't know are biblical but are. Okay. Everyone all right so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So those are our 2 examples of the infancy Gospels. They are fun to know. But you can tell by these stories there's probably a good reason that they're not in our New Testament, right? Okay. Especially since they're late. But they are out there. These are real Gospels. Okay. Passion Gospels. These are kind of fun. Passion Gospels, as I said before in our introduction, they are narrative in form. What separates them from regular narrative Gospels is that they are only narratives about the passion itself. That's all it is. They're talking about nothing but the death, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's all they're doing. Okay. Now let's start. Let me see. Here we go. Just as Christians would tell stories about Jesus as an infant and a young boy, so too they would tell stories which extended the traditions about his trial, death, and resurrection. And here are examples. The Gospel of Peter, the Coptic Gospel of Peter. They are not to be confused. This one's in Coptic, this one's in Greek. And the Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas, we've known did exist as early as the 2nd century AD from the writings of Irenaeus, but we did not have a copy of it until a few decades ago. We found a copy of the Gospel of Judas, and it is fascinating. And it's definitely a Gnostic gospel. Absolutely clearly a Gnostic gospel. Who would pick Judas as the hero of the story? The Gnostics would, and I can show you why. Okay. These are the Passion Gospels. Okay. Let's start with the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter was extremely popular among many Christians in the 2nd century, despite the fact that Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, forbade its use, claiming that it contained passages which supported the Docetic Christology. Remember what Docetism is. That comes from the Greek word dokeo. The Gnostics believe this. Docetism is a doctrine of Gnosticism. Docetism is the belief that Jesus only appeared or seemed to be human, but in fact was not. He was purely divine, but only was a phantom projection, if you will, of being human. Really wasn't human. Make sense? Okay. This is what the Bishop of Antioch says about it, and He's probably correct. Okay. Perhaps the most striking passage of the narrative is an actual account of Jesus' resurrection and emergence from the tomb, an account not found in any of the other earlier Gospels. Let me walk you through it. It's a fascinating account. Okay. During the night hours, the people of Jerusalem hear a great noise and observe the heavens open up. Okay. Very similar to the opening up of the heavens at the baptism of Jesus. Okay. Two men descend in a great splendor, okay? Presumably angelic beings. The stone before the tomb rolls away of its own account. Nobody moves it, it just moves itself, okay? And the two men enter. These two men, of course, that's exactly how the angel in Mark's Gospel is described, as a man at the empty tomb, dressed in white, a young man, we assume it's an angel, okay, who makes the announcement to the women, you're looking for Jesus, he's not here, go tell Peter and his disciples that he is risen and will go meet them in Galilee. That's Mark's Gospel, okay, so this is not too dissimilar. In this case there were two. Now, by the way, it's also interesting to note that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't agree on the accounts either. In I think Mark and John you have one angel. In Matthew and Luke you have two. And you don't. And in all four of them, they're not all in the same place. Some of them are inside the tomb. Some are outside the tomb. Where are they? It's the accounts are really all over the place in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So this is at least in keeping with the tradition that these two men who descend from the heavens are probably angelic beings, and they go into the tomb. Okay. Okay. From the tomb there emerges three men. The heads of two of them reach into heaven. Okay. I don't know what that looks like, but that's what it's being described, and so I'm just trying to illustrate it by putting big heads on these guys. They look almost alien, according to the way it's described, okay? They come out with a third person, presumably Jesus, right? The two angels are bringing Jesus out because he's raised from the dead. This is strangely enough, this Gospel of Peter is doing something that none of the other Gospels do. There never is a witness to the resurrection in any of the four Gospels. Let me say that again. There are no witnesses to the resurrection in any of the four Gospels. All the witnesses that take place, and they only take place in Matthew, Luke, and in John, are post-resurrection occurrences. Jesus is already raised from the dead when they see him. Nobody in any of the four canonical Gospels sees Jesus get up from the dead. Okay, does that make sense? This comes closer to anything that we've had so far. The Gospel of Peter actually gives us a witness to the resurrection. If you want to take this account seriously. I'll be honest with you, I don't. But it's an interesting read, okay? So the two of them come out, their heads reach into heaven, they bring a third person with them, presumably Jesus. Okay? They're supporting a third whose head reaches beyond the heavens. His head is even higher. So how, I don't know. So anyway, that's that's the case. Now, you think that's bizarre. The story gets even stranger. Okay? Behind them emerges a cross. A cross walks out of the tomb behind these people. What was it doing in there in the first place? I don't know. And that it walked out, that is also kind of bizarre. Okay? You can see, by the way, why this is described as docetic by the Bishop of Antioch, because this is so surrealistic. It's hard to imagine that that this is being put forward as a Jesus who's actually physical in reality. He only appears to be physical, which is Docetism. Okay, makes sense? All right, now, it gets stranger then. A voice then speaks from heaven, "Have you preached to those who are sleeping?" And by the way, sleeping is an ancient metaphor for being dead. Paul uses it constantly. In Thessalonians and many of his other writings, he'll talk about those who have fallen asleep. And it's just his way of saying people who have died. Okay? People who have fallen asleep. And that's what this is a reference to. It's a metaphor. It's an idiom for those who have died. Have you preached to those who are dying? Presumably all of humanity. Okay? The cross replies, yes. So we've got a walking, talking cross in the story. Okay? How bizarre. Okay? All right. The account of this narrative have probably been drawn from stories about Jesus' passion and resurrection, which were in wide circulation among Christians. Christians were probably telling all sorts of stories about Jesus, and that this gospel simply assembles those stories, and this is what you get with the Gospel of Peter. The author of the Gospel of Peter, living perhaps at the beginning of the 2nd century A.D., did what others had done before him, and as others would do afterward. He collected the stories that he had heard and created a narrative of the words and deeds of Jesus, the risen Jesus. Okay, that's what's going on in this gospel, and I'm not. There's really nothing more to be said. That's the gist of the story. Okay.
If you only had a camera there, folks.
Oh, wouldn't that be the case even now, right? But here's what's interesting, by the way. Let me say something about that. A lot of people have asked the question, wouldn't it be easier to believe in the resurrection of Jesus if we actually had cameras there and a medical doctor who could examine Jesus and do a DNA test, 23andMe on Jesus before he dies, and then test the body of Jesus after he's raised from the dead, confirm that he's living, and that it's the same Jesus? Even if we had that kind of scientific evidence, it still would not produce the statement of faith that Christians are making. It's not that Christians are saying that Jesus is raised from the dead. We are saying that. It's what we're saying, who raised him from the dead. Christians are saying that it was God who raised Jesus from the dead. That is never going to be filmed. That's never going to be scientifically verified. Sure, Jesus is raised from the dead. Did the devil do it? Did some other force do it? No. According to Christianity, God did it. That will always be an article of faith, because there's no way to prove that. It's just what Christians believe. So there are certain aspects, no matter how scientific we get, that Christianity is simply going to have to take on faith. And I have no problem with that. I have no problem. Yes, don't get me wrong. I live in a post-scientific world. I understand that how absurd it sounds to be talking about someone who's been dead being resuscitated and brought back to life. I do, believe me. I understand how strange that is. I am simply acting on the faith that whatever happened, whatever the miracle was in the resurrection of Jesus, it was an act of God. And that can never be proven. It's just something I choose to believe. And
Jesus had those powers. He resurrected people too.
Yes. Now, here's the catch. Christians are very clear not to say that Jesus raised himself from the dead, and there's a reason he couldn't. Because if he could, then he wasn't dead, and sort of defeats the purpose. So Christians never claim that Jesus... in fact, you'll notice Presbyterians are very careful even about the hymns they sing at Easter. We don't talk about Jesus... we don't... Well, we will say them, but we try to dissuade people from talking about Jesus rising from the dead. We use the phrase, Jesus is raised from the dead, passive voice. It's being done to him by God the Father. Because Jesus can't raise himself. Why? Because he's dead. And his death is important. The death of Jesus is important because if he's not dead, then there is no resurrection. Make sense? So this is, again, it's another one of those acts of faith. It's a choice of faith. That it's God who does this. So.
What would these tombs have been like back then? Because he was 4,
Mm-hmm.
and he would have been buried in a
It was a borrowed tomb, yeah. So Joseph of Arimathea got to use it after all. But no, the
So would it just have been a cave where a bunch of people were buried?
yeah, there we actually do have sites of ancient burials, several, and there are some legends. By the way, it's interesting. You can there are two sites in Israel today that claim to be the burial site of Jesus. One is the traditional site known as the Church of the Resurrection, which is in Jerusalem, and it was marked as the burial place of Jesus by Helena, the mother of Constantine, who came down to Israel in the 4th century and declared this was the spot where Jesus lay. And they built an entire. You go there, you can go inside the church. The church is built on top of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus purportedly was raised from the dead. There's a tomb. You can go down into it. There's another site, though, that people claim, but we don't know this. None of keep in mind again, Christianity surrounds itself with lore and legend. We've got anytime we think something miraculous happened by Jesus on a particular site in Israel, Christians built a church on that site. They just boom put a building on top of it. We don't know that it's true. We don't know. And I'm trying to be honest about it, that Jesus at that time was not important enough for people to have kept those kinds of records. We don't have a birth certificate on Jesus. We don't have a death certificate. He was not that important. I'm not trying to be insulting. That's just a fact. He was a backwoods nobody in the Roman Empire. Okay. So we don't know where he was buried, so these sites that you see are simply there by tradition. Now, they're good traditions, and they allow people in their piety and on their Christian pilgrimages to have a focal point, which by the way, I understand the value in spirituality. To people like to have relics. They like to have focal points for their spiritual journeys. We do know this. We know the so-called Via Dolorosa. We know the path that Jesus would have walked from the Roman portico to the site of the crucifixion. That we know, simply because we know the layout of the ancient city of Jerusalem, and people still walk it today. They have to go around a certain section. There's a wall now that's built into a place, but that's another point. So when people are trying to do the Stations of the Cross in the Via Dolorosa, Christians around Holy Week will do this every year. And I don't disparage them from doing it, but you don't have to be a good Christian. So we do know something, though, about what the ancient tombs looked like. They were, for the most part, sometimes hewn out little caves in sandstone or limestone. And they were covered by a stone of some sort, and people would put the bodies in there, and once the body decayed, then families would go in and take the bones after the body decayed and put them in ossuaries so that they could still use the tomb for future bodies. And these ossuaries would either be put over in little cubbies within the cave, or taken and put in another location. But that's that's how burials were done back then. So,
I didn't mean to get off topic.
no, it's a good question. The Coptic, can I go a few more minutes? We're doing well. The Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. There's another document told of the perspective of Jesus' closest disciples, Peter. The Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, and this is Coptic indicates, of course, it's a Egyptian form of Greek, which almost always is going to guarantee that it's going to be Gnostic, because the Gnostic communities that prevailed were often Coptic, Egyptian Coptic Gnostics. Okay, This is not to be confused with the Greek apocalypse of Peter, to be discussed in a later session. We'll talk about that later. The Coptic apocalypse of Peter contains the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, but this time from a highly unusual and patently Gnostic perspective. And it's just so bizarre, it's fun. Okay? The book describes Jesus' crucifixion as Peter himself saw it happen. Okay, it's being told from Peter's perspective. Okay, while he is standing, talking to Jesus, as Peter, who is apparently standing beside Peter, he sees the soldiers nailing Jesus to the cross. Get this: Peter is talking to Jesus. Jesus is standing next to him, while both of them are watching Jesus being crucified by the Roman soldiers. There are two Jesuses. Okay. Are there two different Jesuses here? Okay, that's what's being said in this apocalypse, if you will. Stranger still, the story's not finished yet. Peter sees another figure, Christ himself, above the cross, laughing at the entire proceedings. Are there three Jesuses? That's what it looks, and there are in this story. There are three Jesuses. Peter is standing next to Jesus watching the events happen. There's this Jesus being crucified. And then there's this third Jesus up in the sky laughing at what's happening. Okay. In his confusion, Peter turns to Jesus, the one next to him, and asks, and he asks, "What am I seeing, Lord? Is it you yourself whom they take, and are you holding on to me? Who is this one above the cross, who is glad and laughing? And is it another person whose feet and hands they are hammering?" Jesus' reply is equally intriguing. "He whom you see above the cross, glad and laughing, is the living Jesus." So of all three of them, the real Jesus is the one above the cross laughing. Okay.
He has the last laugh.
Yeah, he does. But what he's laughing at is going to be interesting. "But he into whose hands and feet they are driving the nails is his physical part, which is the substitute." This is clearly a Gnostic gospel. Okay. "They are putting to shame that which is in its likeness, but look at him and me." Look at the one up there, look at me. We are the real Jesus. The one on the cross is just a physical substitute. Jesus goes on to explain that it was only his clay vessel that was crucified. Only his outer shell was being put to death. The material part of Jesus is not his true person. It is the creation of the lower creator God who made this world. That's a standard Gnostic belief. Remember that the physical world is bad, the product of created by a bad God, but only the spiritual is what's good and real. Okay. His real, true self is his spiritual being within, who was released from prison of the body when it was killed. This is why Jesus stands above the cross laughing. Those killing him wrongly think they can destroy him, but they have power only over his outward form. So that's why Jesus laughs. He's laughing, "Oh, you're causing all that pain and suffering, but only on something that's not real." Okay. They do not realize that the spirit cannot die. That's the point of this particular gospel. Okay. Clearly Gnostic. This is clearly Gnostic. Okay. All right, and finally, we've got, bear with me, this is the last one. The Gospel of Judas Iscariot. Okay. By the way, there are lots of other Gospels I could have talked about, but these are the ones that are just fun. The key theme of this book is the superiority of Judas to all other disciples. Judas is the only one who gets it right, according to this Gospel. Okay. In the key line of the text, Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Well, who's the man that clothes me? Well, what he's saying is that the real Jesus is trapped inside that shell of flesh that looks like Jesus. Judas will betray him to be crucified, and then once this shell is crucified, then the real Jesus can be liberated. Judas becomes the hero of the story precisely because he betrays Jesus, turns him over, hands him over. Make sense? In other words, by handing Jesus over to death, Judas will make it possible for him to escape the material trappings of his body, which is Jesus' ultimate goal. Okay. Jesus' outer shell must be destroyed so that he can return to his spiritual home. No one, least of all the disciples, understand this, since they think the creator of this material world is the one true God. All the other disciples are stupid dupes. They don't get it. Judas is the only one who truly understands. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is only Judas who sees it. Judas is the saint in the story. All the others...
He makes himself the saint, though.
well, whoever's writing the story is making Judas the
Oh,
saint.
okay.
Okay, yeah. Judas didn't write this. Okay. I mean, he really couldn't. If, in fact, the stories are true and he commits suicide, right? Okay. All right, so real quick conclusion. The other Gospels. All right. What can we say about other Gospels, those which did not make it into the New Testament? The non-canonical Gospels are important because they show us that Christianity continued to reflect on the significance of Jesus and to incorporate their views into stories told about his words and deeds. After the Gospels were written, it didn't stop Christians and other groups from telling stories about Jesus. Other stories were beginning to circulate. Okay. And to me, by the way, I would also add another important point, is that we know what Christianity is by looking at what it's not. Why was it that certain books were chosen to be excluded? Excluding the Gnostic Gospels that emphasized Jesus' spirituality and deplored the physicality of creation tells us that Christianity cherishes physical existence. Christianity believes that the body is good, that it's not evil. It's not inherently evil. I mean, people can do terrible things with the body, but it's not created evil. That the human being is holistic. Body, spirit, soul, mind, heart. All of that is that by which you are to love God. To love God with all of your heart, mind, strength, and soul. Right? The whole notion then in Christianity is that we don't try to escape the body. We're not trying to escape this world. Salvation is not about simply waiting until this body dies so that you can go to heaven. Christianity is much broader than that. Early Christians understood and criticized those who would say otherwise, that feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, healing the sick, all of that's important. It wouldn't be important if the body didn't matter. But those things do matter. And so that's what these are among some of the things we learn about Christianity by looking at what it's not. You see. That's why I think a study like this is kind of fun. It's a nice little excursus from our study of the New Testament, why these books didn't make their way in there. And I'm so glad they didn't.